Tapalaif John. Gaelic of Gamat Filanta. Agus Hanaticus and Bishop Juliusach de Shahor. Had the high mission Magalic Harston. Agus Conishipshin Hamindochus, and Snipican, Vrieren, Evisacum. Be me Clachug Gaelic and Drastis Ries just Kinja Hansen Norach. Ach had the read of na Oram Gonsa be Shohanoch, Convery Vulig. When I lick me in Magreach, Shetallach gehaun Gonsa if he told her fake in Yelang. Han je kaal een Yelang Hanam Sitcher, get the Hakal Lakamri Ilan Hirug. Samen Yelang Hirug, Kutjach, Honich me in Doshach, Rishin Dunjachor, Erevilshin Kumar Kanya and Noch, Inus, MacLeod, nach Maram. Dan aan ze blion een nieuw keer fischet ze Shia, Evashin. Agus washin je kumar kanje keert blion ach nun krefteren. Wa innes aan een chirurg, als zo'n kanje gaan je haarstje Evashin. Agus washin lichele uit karn, ook aan een chirurg. Maar kanje gaan, wel garooi naar kanje gaan, want doen je pijl door geen haar naar ook. Ach marurum, een uramach, dan mag kalm. Waar zo maar minister aans na wochen, minister skieren een woch. Bij reischen aan een chirurg. Agus hanika chirurg skieren een woch. Agus gaan geroer een chilang akal. Nu de hoek munter chirurg, karn kunje ja. Karn urum, karn speech. Gaat de huk mesje kus een romeuit uit je gelauwst aan de balalijn. Woog kan gunje gewoon weer kalm. Kan de hoek bechiristig, karn ja. Zij haast bio. Smendig. Agus unjenjation, hoek hoosig in us MacLeod, kun je geen gaske gehoekal aan de show. Agus Baun door de wij aan een chirurg, agus sin lichele, een konrachig, keert blione ach een grifteren, agus sin kutjach uit karn gewoon wie kalm. Baun een noorschen is smendig in us MacLeod, gofrikkerig ze weg. Kun je gaan ille, een gaskig, agus ha een brech kan ha een sin, een torsner kun je een gaskig. Heurig uit aan eiretjenering. Ha gaskich ille aan kutjach. Agus saun kumar kunje orsen, le orm agus speech ha mesje sjo anoch. Han gaskich a ha skrivig, sa ha pechkig, echkri na gael. A ha kutjach getjene tjiffer, am een echkri na gael. Ha vi echkri na gael, as iwnas yn anyaman, chan nwryn i fi. Yn ys MacLeod, mari anyam. Thomas MacCalaman, mari anyam. Agus je gaskich ille hasyn. Gaskich a ha dian y ffeim na'n wahyn. Agus syl mysio cyfel ei ffricorach dar iryf. Gymbein sy sionoch y bryn. Mar chynjachan agus mar orm. Ynys MacLeod. Ach kutjach, mar chynjachan agus mar orm. Yn ormach Thomas MacCalaman. Mar sy'n, ham I dal o hwrsgwyf o'r gyrryd ham mynd o'ch ys chafir o ata syfyr fydd Calaman. Gysores dy syfyr fydd Calaman y hyf creuterach. Se minister y fan yn Thomas MacCalaman. Minister an sy'n ygwas geistja. Ach, ac yn y lawn, se minister y fawn dyn choiasnach. Gydir. Chan I fain anem yn gwynia, y fa fanier ga, besyn y fferiaf gan nwyym ar gymbiag. Ach cwtiach, cor am y siaral gwynia. Be minister y fawn dyn manem yn, agos minister cwtiach dyn cor bara. Dyn I irisio, nach cwrg y hen, rwy am yn does yn bi. Ach dyn I ac yn ynawn, ein ffeim môr dyn gaeltoch. Agos hisif ham yn dochus, an commas ri Angus MacLeod. Han je doen je moren van de Ines. Hij kun je me visjes over heel van een chirurg. Ze aan de shit dagens koute uitrum lie Kun je irischal koor. Kortach ri Thomas MacCallum. Ach li hele rinjat veel moor dan gaeltoch. Ik armen een sonrichtje. Hami een doelkutjach gebele anaparach veel maar kunt huid woch kunnen perlen. Gebel te wille echt in een gael. Wo hoeft een gael heen. Als je sinne goed gebel meer zo'n prinse wereld. Geruk me teunje nach konje stogen. En jechkerach gehakken me nog. Dan begin ik de eerste Gaelic. Agus mar sin ha mé dul bhrín riomh má Thomas MacCallum. Ha mé hín ar an leiricin ag Thomas MacCallum I dhéisacha, agus dhéobh cúitmha den scríbhíonn ar a bhile nóra Jacams ar a bántacha go mách, an san leabhar seo, as ciún gléirich na stráin, scríbhíonn Thomas MacCallum, cha I chur amach le Common Lítrachas Gaelic na Hallapa, Scottish Gaelic Text Society, sin na scríbhíonn aice, Skrifin fali na hastian. Agus seo cúteach echgri a bheitthe héin. Mo wagu seo. Agus handale war sin acin, mar ialaf a gaeltoch mar a chonig Thomas MacCallum I na Highland, agus mar ialaf cúteach upper héin. It gives me great pleasure to be here tonight, and I'm very much indebted to the Islands Book Trust for inviting me and giving me the privilege of giving this Angus MacLeod lecture, the 9th lecture, on what I think is the 10th anniversary of the death of Angus MacLeod. I think we even are commemorating the day of his death. And so it is indeed a great privilege for me to stand here and to deliver this lecture. I mentioned in my Gaelic introduction that there are different kinds of heroes in the Highlands. There are those that fight almost with their swords and their weapons. There are also those who fight quietly for others. And I think that Angus MacLeod belonged to the latter. He was a hero in his own day. And I like to think that the man that I'm commemorating in this lecture, the Reverend Dr. T.M Murchison, was a man in a similar mold. They were men for their own time, for their own generation, and they changed the world. And sometimes people didn't notice that they were changing the world. But when we look back and when we use particular sources, we see what they achieved. I've been struck by the parallel between Angus MacLeod and T.M Murchison. First of all, they were both Gaelic speakers and native Highlanders who took up the crofters' cause with passion and commitment. Second, they were both foundational figures in the creation of bodies which were of great significance to 20th century crofting. T.M Murchison was instrumental in creating the Highland Development League, while Angus MacLeod was a founder of the Scottish Crofters' Union. And third, Tom Murchison and Angus MacLeod were dedicated researchers and writers on Highland and crofting matters, and both have bequeathed immense archives for our understanding of the history of their respective areas. Kyle Ray and Glenelg in Murchison's case, and Calbost and Lochs in MacLeod's. Murchison's collection of manuscripts is housed in Glasgow University Library, while Angus MacLeod's collection is held by the Islands Book Trust and Coman Echgrin Pàirc at the Ravens Point Centre here in Lochs. The papers left by both men have resulted in extremely valuable publications. And as I've indicated, this lecture will be based very largely on the surviving writings of the Reverend Dr. Thomas Moffat Murchison. I find this interesting in another way. When I was here in Lewis just a few weeks ago, I was talking about the Reverend Donald McCallum, who was the Minister of Lochs and was a crofting activist. He was well known as an orator and as a friend and, I suppose, advisor of crofters, and had different roles during the 1880s, 1890s, and into the early 20th century. I concluded my lecture by saying that the Reverend Donald McCallum of Lochs was really over and out by the, I suppose, 1920. He had really passed his peak long since. He didn't have an answer for the new world that was emerging because the needs of crofting were actually changing. McCallum had worked, he'd operated on crofters' behalf in the late 19th century. He was doing the job with rousing speeches, even going to prison on their behalf. He was inciting them to do this and that, to fight for their own rights. And as the world changed, McCallum somehow didn't have the voice that fitted that new world as he came into the 20th century. It's telling that on McCallum's glebe in Lochs, in 1892, I think, there was a land raid. And McCallum didn't know what to do with this. He didn't know how to handle it. And the man who once had been so radical on the side of the crofters was scuttling off to Stornoway to get advice from the people there, the landholders there, on how he was to handle the land raiders back in Lochs. He was out of his depth with that kind of action on crofters by crofters. He didn't understand that, and he couldn't really handle it. He was in a different world. And this is where T.M Murchison comes into the picture. T.M Murchison's mindset, his ability to handle the crofting issues that were to the fore in the 20th century, made up for the lack in Donald McCallum's. They were both men of their time. McCallum had his crofting mentality fashioned when great rhetoric was the way of arguing your case. The rhetoric was there too with T.M Murchison, but his mind for crofting was formed in the context of land raiding and crofters actually going onto the land and saying, this is our land, and holding on to it, and having what were termed at the time illegal occupations. It was a very different world, and T.M Murchison came into that world and helped to change the world for the better. So, Donald McCallum of Lochs, he more or less faded out in the 1920s, certainly by 1920. At the same time, there was a young man in Skye, T.M Murchison, just coming to his mature years. And he took up the cause of the crofters. He likewise was a minister in the Church of Scotland. To bring you to the point where T.M Murchison was introduced to land raiding and to the implications of this for his own life, let me just give you a very brief sketch of T.M Murchison. T.M Murchison, believe it or not, was born and spent his initial years in Govan in Glasgow. His people were from Kyle on his father's side and from Glenelg on his mother's. His father, Callum Murchison, was a sailor and a crofter. And he went to Glasgow and he lived in Govan and he worked with the Skye Navy on the Clyde. He also sailed on the yachts that Highland people often crewed in the summer years. Now, T.M Murchison was brought up in Govan in Glasgow as an English speaker. He had no Gaelic. And he came back to Kyle in 1913. He came back as a young boy with only English. Why did he come back? He came back because his father, Callum, had inherited the family croft. And Callum's mother was in one end of the house, and the newly arrived Murchison family were in the other. And she had no English, and Tom had no Gaelic. And so Tom Murchison learned Gaelic from his grandmother in Kyle-Ray. It's interesting comment on how Gaelic was going at that time. And it's a great thing for us that Tom Murchison came back to Kyle-Ray from Govan in Glasgow with his parents. There were a number in the family. It wasn't a big family, but it was an influential one. The Murchisons were well known. They were quite some kindred. Think of Sir Roderick Murchison and other members of that family who made a mark on the wider world. So Tom Murchison then, with his parents, came back to Kyle-Ray, and they worked the family croft. They used to cross regularly over to Glenelg. It's just a very short crossing. They were great seamen, his father and his uncle Johnny, Shawnee Hallam-Vurichy. They were very, very able with boats, and they went backwards and forwards between Glenelg and Kyle-Ray. And this matrix, as it were, between Glenelg and Kyle-Ray was formative for Tom Murchison. He learned crofting the hard way. He had to do the croft work. He had to help with it when his father was away on the yachts. When his father was away on the yachts, Tom would get time off from school, from the Kyle-Ray school and then from Portree High, to work the croft. And it's quite a telling comment on crofting at that time, that was how it worked. You got time off from school to go back and do the work when your father was away earning his living on the yachts or whatever. But Tom Murchison learned crofting the hard way by doing it, and it's the best way to learn crofting. You then are less inclined to write romantic nonsense about crofts and all that they mean in the sunset. You really know what they mean in the force 10 gale, and he knew all of that. He knew all about the deer that came swimming across from Glenelg to Kyle-Ray that turned up through the night when the crofters were asleep. They used to put tin cans out to warn them, tin cans attached to fences and whatnot, but still the deer would come over. He learned all about that and the occasions when, well, you used your gun if all else failed. He knew everything about crofting. He knew how dangerous the life was on the shores and on the narrows of Kyle-Ray and so on. So this man was being formed. He was a very bright boy as well, and we can see that. He went to Portree High, and it was when he was in Portree High that there was a formative moment for him. He lodged in Bayfield, Portree, with a man who was called Sandy Nicholson. And Sandy Nicholson was a great land leaguer. And he would take the youngsters who were in his lodging to political events. And one of these happened. It was a fiscal event rather than a political one, but it had political implications. Sandy took the 14-year-old schoolboy Thomas Moffat Murchison to the Sheriff Court in Portree on 6 October 1921. And he took him there so that he could witness the trial of the Rassie Raiders. There was the little lad from Kyle-Ray in the courthouse. And there, Murchison heard the famous crofter's solicitor of that time, Donald Shaw, who lived from 1871 to 1944. He heard Donald Shaw defending the Rassie Raiders. Donald Shaw was a native of Tormore in Skye. And Murchison used to say that this was a defining moment in awakening his interest in crofting matters. He wrote many articles, Tom Murchison. He was constantly writing, and one of the reasons that we know, my generation knows Tom Murchison so well, was that it was impossible to get away from him. He was either on the radio broadcasting, taking Gaelic services, or explaining crofting matters to the Highland people, advising them through radio, very important. But he was also writing. He was editing Life and Work, Gaelic Supplement. He would appear in the Stornoway Gazette under the pen name of Donald Down. He was doing all sorts of things like that. and he was writing these wonderful accounts, often for transmission on radio, of people that he had met, and among them was Donald Shaw. And Donald Shaw, like Tom Murchison, is one of the forgotten heroes of this period. I was fascinated to note that he is not mentioned much by, I suppose, the headline writers of Crofting in Highland history. But he is remembered by Joni Buchanan and Leah Leneman for his part in advising crofters at the time of the difficulties with Lord Leverhulme and the standoff between the raiders and Leverhulme over Coll and Gress farms in 1920. But when we look back, we see Donald Shaw working on behalf of most crofters who were trying to get land for themselves, for the raiders. He acted on behalf of the land raiders in Tiree, Balranald, in North Uist, Portree, Stratheard, Skye, Harris, and Rassay. So in the courthouse in Portree, in the courthouse, Tom Murchison heard Donald Shaw in action, and he remembered what was going on. The charge brought against the Rassay raiders, he tells us in Gaelic, was that they had defied the authority of the law. Donald Shaw came from Edinburgh to plead on their behalf, and he certainly did that in a skillful, methodical manner. He told the sheriff how the grandfathers of these men had been evicted from that very patch of land. He told how poor their circumstances were in the island of Rona, and that they couldn't go home now as their miserable houses had collapsed. He told how they had served their kingdom in the war, and how houses and land had been promised to them when they would return. They were willing to pay a reasonable rent. He asked the sheriff to delay their sentence, to give an opportunity to resolve the matter sensibly, but the sheriff refused to wait. He imposed a fine of £15 on each one, or 20 days in prison. The men went to prison in Inverness. And so we have a glimpse from Murchison's boyhood years of what it was like to be in a courthouse in Portree when land raiders were being tried. He tells us that the Rassay men were released at Christmas 1921. They returned to the crofts which they had occupied, and these were later allocated to them by the Board of Agriculture. And then Murchison records that the Rassay men thanked Donald Shaw heartily for their defence and his assistance in obtaining land. And as a memorial of his service, they agreed to call their new crofts Shaw's Holdings. So Murchison was formed in the era of the land raid. He was formed in the period which has shaped so much of Lewis crofting. John Randall kindly was taking me to different parts today, and so often the comment was being made, oh, that house was built 1920s. It was a very important period in shaping crofting, and we think in our naivety sometimes that crofting has been here forever. A great deal of the modern of crofting as we know it was formed in the 20th century, and particularly before 1930. It's true in Tiree, it's true in Lewis. There was the classical, I suppose, foundational period of crofting, but then there was this very important period when more land had to be given to the crofters or to the people who had no land, really were cotters, they weren't crofters at all. And they had to get the land, and it was in this period that Murchison's mind was formed as an activist. He was seen in the court by the headmaster of Portree, and the headmaster ticked him off next day in school for having been out so late at night. But we indeed were fortunate that Tom Murchison was out so late at night and that he saw this, because it changed his view, or it put another strand into his mind and made him I suppose, part of what he was. It's interesting how these defining moments come into our experiences. Now, after leaving Portree, Tom Murchison went to Glasgow University. He did the MA degree there. He was the sort of lad who performed brilliantly, without any effort, in just about any subject you could name. He left Portree High as the Boy Ducks, but there had been a falling out with the school headmaster, and he was never given his Ducks medal officially. He was given it, but not officially. So by the time Tom Murchison left Portree, he was a wee bit of a fighter. He had, I suppose, won his spurs at Portree. He'd seen the Land Raiders being tried. He heard Donald Shaw standing up for them. And he too had defied his own headmaster and said, "No bullying, sir." And actually, he wrote to Inverness to stop the bullying of the headmaster in Portree High. Now, there's an interesting dimension of education, isn't it? Murchison went on, he became a minister. And in the fullness of time, he came back to Glenelg as his first charge. How fascinating that his path led back to Glenelg, where his own people were. And he ministered to his own people from 1932 until 1937. Now, this was very interesting too, because another formative moment or experience occurred in Glenelg. Tom Murchison became very much aware of the needs of the Highlands and Islands when he saw them in his own parish in Glenelg. It was there that he began to act as a spokesperson on behalf of oppressed crofters. And he started off his career as a politician, if you like, on behalf of crofters by taking up the pen for Glenelg crofters, smallholders who had got into debt with the repayments to the Board of Agriculture. So let me just give you another translation of part of Murchison's writings. He tells us how he became involved in the struggle for the Glenelg smallholders. This is what he writes. "I became particularly familiar with the desperate plight of the new crofters, the smallholders, who had been settled on land holdings after the Kaiser's War, the First World War. About 150 years ago, there were several crofting townships in Glenmore, Glenelg, but they were evicted, and Glenmore was turned into a large sheep farm with 3 or 4 shepherds, where there was formerly a large population. The Board of Agriculture bought this farm, and in 1924 they settled 9 crofters on the land of Bealvery. Each crofter had his own arable land, and all of them together as joint holders had sheep stock on the hill. They held the land on rent, and they had to repay the cost of stock to the Board of Agriculture. The crofters of Bealvery had 1,100 sheep, and their market price was £5,187. But in 1933, 9 years after they had begun to repay the loan for stock, they had already repaid £3,363, and £3,309 was still outstanding. They were toiling hard, but at the end of every year, because of the drop in prices of sheep and wool, there was no money to pay their debts or to give themselves any profit or salary. The same situation prevailed in many other areas. Some of the Bealvery crofters lacked the means to build suitable houses, and they and their young families were living in small wooden houses that they had acquired at a price from the Board of Agriculture. Despite sending many letters to the Board of Agriculture and to the Secretary of State for Scotland, no help or advice was forthcoming. The government's mantra was, "Be patient until prices improve." But prices did not improve, and there was no prospect of that. So the minister of Glenelg Parish Church wrote to the newspapers on behalf of the Glenelg crofters, and attracted the attention of others who were in similar difficulties elsewhere in the Highlands. In 1935, Murchison presented to the Secretary of State for Scotland a petition on behalf of 693 smallholders in Sutherland, Ross and Cromarty, Inverness and Argyll. After some prevarication, this resulted in a moratorium on the repayment of crofters' capital debt. Now, that was the minister of Glenelg Parish Church at work. So don't let us say that ministers are concerned only with the salvation of people's souls. There were many ministers around who had a social awareness and a concern for their communities, as well as being evangelical men, as T.M Murchison assuredly was. So here he was as a comparatively young man in action on behalf of the crofters. This, incidentally, was how I became interested in Murchison's work. Because when Murchison used to broadcast on Gaelic radio, we all stopped the work we were doing and we would troop in to listen to him, whether he was doing a Gaelic service in the afternoon or giving a talk. And my father would often salute him and say, well, he was different. When others would do nothing to help us, he did. And on the list of crofters crofting areas that Murchison helped in that period in the 1930s, there is Tiree. And my father had never forgotten that T.M Murchison, the minister of Glenelg, had come to the rescue of crofters, because the problems weren't restricted to Glenelg. They belonged to other parts of the Highlands as well. And this was another area, another point that Murchison moved to act upon. You can see him working step by step. When he began to tackle the troubles of the Glenelg crofters, he realized that the Highlands as a whole really had much the same difficulties, and that they all had to be tackled. So what did he do? He met a number of influential people in Inverness, among them John McCormick, whom we know, whose name is well known in nationalist circles, and Duncan MacNeill, a lawyer in Inverness. And he proposed setting up a new Highland League to tackle some of the issues. So they met in Inverness in August 1935, and they planned another league. Now, a league is quite a name that resonates because of land leagues and so on. Then, as Providence would have it, Murchison became aware of another man doing much the same thing in another part of the Highlands, namely Dr. Lachlan Grant of Ballachulish. He was a general practitioner in Ballachulish, and he was a stout champion of the slate quarriers. And he too was thinking of setting up a Highland League to tackle some of the problems that were in his part of the Highlands. Lachie Grant also published a booklet called A New Deal for the Highlands, and it was based on ideas that were coming from the United States, and in particular Roosevelt's Tennessee Valley Authority, and the New Deal there. So instead of setting up competing leagues, Murchison joined forces with Lachie Grant of Ballachulish, and they set up a new Highland Development League. Now, this is one of the issues which I must stress. This is an achievement on the part of Murchison and Grant which has never had its proper place in Highland history. If you read accounts by historians like even Jim Hunter, my good old friend and sparring partner from debates in Oban High School, you will find that he thinks of the new Highland Development League as something, well, it was almost incidental to the course of Highland history. And I would beg to differ with Jim. It was very important indeed. And I don't know what would have happened if Murchison and Grant had not set up the Highland Development League in 1936, January 1936. This was the first think tank and ginger group for the economic development of the Highlands. It gained immediate support from influential people like John M. Bannerman, who became Lord Bannerman of Kildona. And the League went on then to establish branches throughout the Highlands, which were able to advise crofters and to move things along. Its secretary was kept busy with endless complaints about bad roads, poor piers, high fares, problems with sheep, bracken, rates on croft houses, and many other issues. But the League wasn't just some agony aunt for crofters, writing in saying, what am I going to do? The sheep have come over the fence again, this sort of thing. It was very active in the political front. It brought pressure to bear on the government in 1936 when a committee of inquiry into economic conditions in Scotland, the Scottish Economic Committee, was set up. And its representations resulted in creating the Hillary Subcommittee of Inquiry. That wasn't enough, so the League lobbied the government again to give more power to the Hillary Committee. And eventually the Hillary Committee made a report on the Highlands in 1938. So the Highland Development League, set up by Murchison and Grant, was working not only in the locality, it was also working in the political arena on behalf of Highland people, on behalf of crofters, and taking their case to London, right into government. It was doing all of that. I was part of a group, writes Tom Murchison, which was sent to London to talk to the Secretary of State, Mr. John Colville, and to hold a meeting with Scottish members of Parliament in the House of Commons. So that was going on. It wasn't simply something that was happening at home in Glenelg or wherever. This was something that was going into the corridors of political power, and Tom Murchison was pushing behind the scenes, and very much up front too. Murchison was also quite happy to criticize in a nice way those who were trying to, I suppose, create policy for crofting at that time. He wasn't particularly pleased with the Hillary Committee because it seemed it wanted to appoint a man in authority. Some people called him a Highland dictator who was going to change the course of Highland history, and Murchison was uncomfortable with that. He was also unhappy about politicians' responses to this report. And he criticised, for example, Sir Murdoch MacDonald, MP for Inverness-shire, for, he says, recommending half a dozen patches which can be applied to the Highlands in order to improve matters. That will not do. Sir Murdoch wishes the patching to be assigned to the old tailors, the Board of Agriculture and the Health Board, but that won't do either. And Murchison was quite sceptical about the effectiveness of the Hillary report, but he tried to do his best. In Highland affairs and Gaelic affairs and crofting affairs, it's sometimes very difficult to be positive and constructive when there are things that annoy you. I don't know whether that happens in Lewis, but it happens in my part of the Highlands. And it's very, very difficult to recognise the overall value while criticising the detail. And you see Tom Murchison in this tension all the time. He was particularly annoyed that that report, come the Second World War, just the beginning of the Second World War, was shelved. Wasn't really acted on in any way at all. Now, Jim Hunter claims that Murchison and others, Lachie Grant, he doesn't mention Murchison very much, but he claims that Lachie Grant, and people like him, were charging at an open door. There was the Scottish, I suppose the UK establishment, just waiting for them to make the case for crofting. Well, that certainly isn't what you see if you read the Gaelic writings of Tom Murchison. You see people fighting every inch of the way for justice for crofters, and Tom Murchison and Lachie Grant and others doing exactly that. So that's a couple of pictures of Tom Murchison. Tom Murchison, the Crofting boy in Kyle-Ray. Tom Murchison, the Portree High School boy, going to see the land raiders, the Rassay land raiders, going to prison. Then we have Tom Murchison standing up on behalf of the Glenelg crofters. And then we have Tom Murchison, along with Lachie Grant, creating the Highland Development League. And then we move from that, and we see Tom Murchison also in 1935 opening a new ferry crossing between Glenelg and Kyle-Ray. You know the crossing? It's still active. The little vessel Glenelg goes across. Well, we have that today, thanks to Thomas Moffat Murchison. When T.M Murchison was there, he realized that it was very important for both Glenelg and Kyle-Ray to have that link. And that was a major crossing in Highland history. That was where the cattle went across from the Hebrides, going down to the Falkirk sails, going down there to the Martin Falkirk. Now, he realized that this was a strategic crossing and that it had to be renewed. The boat that actually sailed across had been wrecked in 1915, the most recent boat, and there were no transport arrangements linking Glenelg and Kyle-Ray. So Murchison began to campaign for that too, and he achieved his goal there. He got a little boat called the Kyle-Ray set up. She was plying by about 1934, and he opened the crossing officially in 1935. A new ferry service from Kyle-Ray to Glenelg was inaugurated on Wednesday by the Reverend Thomas Murchison of Glenelg, a strong upholder of the crofters' cause. In his remarks, the minister said that this was one of the oldest ferries in the island, he himself having traced it back for 200 years when it was used for ferrying cattle from Skye to Falkirk Market. The new boat can carry 2 cars, and the charge is to be 8 shillings for a car under 12 horsepower and 10 shillings for heavier motors. So Tom Murchison was involved in setting up that ferry. So if you cross on the Glenelg, remember Tom Murchison. He was active in many other things as well. He worked hard to envisage a new Highlands, and it's fascinating to see him at work, moving another stage, going beyond, as it were, the practical things to the envisioning of the big picture. We see him doing this particularly by 1946. The Second World War had quite an effect on Highland development. It stopped it for a period. Murchison was still at work, nevertheless, trying to get people prepared for the day when there would be peace again, and they had to set to work in the Highlands. By that time, he was back in Glasgow. He had moved from Glenelg Parish Church to St Columba Copeland Road in Govan, and the wheel had gone full circle, and Tom Murchison was back in Govan where he had begun as a boy. But that didn't eliminate the Highland spark. It didn't eliminate his enthusiasm for keeping the Highlands and Islands at the forefront of thinking in Scotland. And so he began to sketch out the wider pictures, the blueprints for the future. He was able to do so partly because of the move to Glasgow, where he was in a media-conscious environment, with broadcasting, with newspapers, with everything, and he had this gift of being able to write an article first time and get it right first time. He had this ability to see clearly where he wanted to go. And in 1946, just as the war ended, he wrote an essay which was broadcast, where he sketched out his personal vision for the Highlands. And he touched on the creation, for example, of a Highland Development Board. He also referred to the need to establish centres of lifelong learning for the people, including a people's college on Swedish and Finnish lines. And we may compare the role of Saul Mor Ostig today. He was seeing the need for these colleges closer to the people than universities were. He advocated the creation of an all-Gaelic newspaper. He himself was at work on a journal which was published in 1948. And he recommended, too, that the Highland people should have a much greater say in their own affairs and that they should come together in an annual Highland Parliament, which would have the respect of central government. So he was involved by then trying to create the big picture for the future of the Highlands. He was concerned also about Highland depopulation. He was horrified at the way in which islands were being depopulated at that time. And I think that one of the formative influences was what he himself saw before his eyes in Kyle-Ray. If you go to Kyle-Ray today, what a change from the days of T.M Murchison. There's no Gaelic. It's almost totally an incomer community. And that happened in other parts of the Highlands and Islands as well. He even went to Fair Isle in 1955 to look at the future of Fair Isle. He was involved in all of this, travelling to see what could be done to maintain communities in the Highlands and particularly the islands. He wrote as follows, just in 1971. "I am no prophet," he wrote, "like the Reverend Lachlan Mackenzie of Lochcarron or Cynnych O'r the seer. Nevertheless, as I look ahead, I envisage the history of the Highlands in the 50 years between now, 1971, and the year 2020 AD somewhat as follows. Between now and the end of the present 20th century, I see the West Highlands filling progressively with non-native people who will come there all summer and gain ownership of land and houses, but who will leave Highland townships empty and desolate all winter. That will mean that fewer and fewer of the Gaels themselves will be left to earn their living in their own land. School after school will be closed in the rural areas, and church after church and Gaelic will soon go out of use as the daily language of the people. Before the end of the century, the Highlands will become a wilderness except for the summer, when outsiders will arrive in droves to replace the Gaels who lived there formerly. I hope it doesn't turn out that way, but I do fear it will be so." Murchison saw people returning to the Highlands, but the whole complexion of the Highlands changing as a consequence. And that's one of the issues with which we've had to wrestle, as the Highlands have in some areas been repopulated. We heard it being discussed even at the Ballallan conference. It was something very close to the agenda of that conference. Now, let me say also a few more things about the wider aspects of Murchison's contribution to Highland development. And that will be, I'm sure, the main, point that I want to get across to you. One of the areas in which Murchison had a great interest was energy and renewables. It's not a new issue, actually. And he was very much involved in trying to develop hydroelectric power for the Highlands. It's fascinating to see the many areas in which T.M Murchison was actually involved. He was at work, and so was the Highland Development League, when Glenafric was up for grabs. And the question arose of who was going to get the benefit of the water of Glenafric. Was it going to be an external company that would come in and do a rip-off of Highland resources? Or would it be the Gaels themselves? Have you heard these arguments before? They were going full steam when the hydroelectric came. They were going full hydro, in fact. Now, Murchison got going, and he and the League began to write letters to the extent that Parliament noticed, and he and his campaigners were summoned to London to answer for what they had been writing about the procedures up north. some MPs claimed that Murchison had transgressed, that he had broken the rules of the Houses of Parliament, and they had got access to information and spread it that he shouldn't have got. And so he was dragged down to London to stand before a committee. Have you heard of this happening? Seem to be very busy down there hauling everyone before them at the moment. Well, T.M Murchison was one of the early victims of cross-examination, but he got out of it. He was very nearly that. The late Dr. Grant Balachulish and the late Mr. Donald Mackay Glasgow and I were the ones who signed the letter on behalf of the Development League. This was the letter that did the damage. All three of us were therefore summoned to go to London without delay to go before an investigative committee under the guidance of Mr. Attlee. Dr. Grant could not go down, but Donald Mackay and I went, and another man, Peter Thompson, a headmaster from Edinburgh, along with us. You can read in the printed version of all the comments that Murchison was making about various committees and so on that were set up for the Highlands. But let me really bring this talk to a conclusion by focusing on this concept of a Highland Development Board. When I was in Glasgow University, I well remember what an exciting time it was, because in 1965, something happened. The Highlands and Islands Development Board was created. And there was a lot of talk among the students about its significance, what it would do for the Highlands and Islands, and so on. And it was presented as something very new, as if the Labour government had come with this wonderful idea of a Highlands and Islands Development Board. New, it was new to some, but in fact, it had a long history. I was astonished when I began to edit the works of T.M Murchison and to take an interest in T.M.'s political views. I was astonished to find that the concept of the Highland Development Board goes right back to the creation of the Highland Development League itself, with Murchison and Grant. From the point that the League was created in 1936, it was agitating for the creation of a Highlands and Islands Development Board. And in 1938, T.M Murchison had his own vision of what this development board should be. He wrote about it in English in 1938. And he said this: "There are two considerations which I believe are fundamental to the Highlands. That the special circumstances of the Highland area require special treatment, and that Highland reconstruction can be achieved on an adequate scale only by tackling the various problems comprehensively and not in isolation. Recognition of these 2 points could best be expressed in practice, I suggest, by the setting up of a single authoritative body to which would be entrusted the planning and direction of a comprehensive scheme of Highland reconstruction and development. Such a body, let us call it the Highland Development Council or Board, the exact name is immaterial, would require to have the confidence of the Highland people, and this means that it would have to be constituted along democratic lines." And he then goes on to say who should be on the board, what the board should do, how the board should be different from existing councils and bodies for Highland development. Elsewhere, he says it ought to have about £20 million, be capable of managing the economic development of the Highlands overall, and then in 1946, in his Gaelic broadcast, in which he envisioned the new Highlands, done in Gaelic, he even called the board by what was to become its Gaelic name 20 years later, Pàirc School. Everything was done, mapped out, 20, 30 years before the Highlands and Islands Development Board was actually created. So who created the Highland Development Board? Who thought about it? Well, I think Tom Murchison and the pioneers from the 1920s and 1930s were the people who did that. And Tom Murchison is, as far as I'm aware, the very first person to give the Highlands and Islands Development Board a local habitation and a name. There were others who had grasped the idea that this was necessary, but Tom Murchison from Kyle-Ray was the first to flesh it out and to give it all its names in English and Gaelic. And that was done, ready and waiting, by 1938. Now, how was this transmitted? Well, the fact is that Tom Murchison was very close to the movers and shakers of the time. He was close to the politicians. He was close to John Lorne Campbell of Cana, for example, and the Sea League. And he was close to another man called Robert Grieve, who became the first chairman of the Highlands and Islands Development Board. He was close to James Shaw Grant. And I have absolutely no doubt that Tom Murchison was at work passing on that vision of the Highlands to these men who later took it up and used their political power to bring it into being with the Labour government in 1965. So that is the background to the Highlands and Islands Development Board. And much of the thinking for it came from that young man who went out to Portree Sheriff Court and saw the Rassie Raiders being tried there in 1921. To try to sum up then, Tom Murchison can be called a prophet without honour in his own land. And one wonders why this is. I think partly it's because Tom Murchison was a minister first and foremost. His first calling was to the gospel, to his parishes, to his people, and as his family have said to me, that was priority number one. He saw himself as a minister. And for that reason, he wasn't pulled into politics. He wasn't sucked into politics as his calling in life. He became in 1969 the moderator of the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland, and we remember him in that capacity. He was also a shy, self-effacing man, and he may never have wanted recognition. But it has always struck me as quite amazing that as the new modern bodies and institutions came into existence in the Highlands for development of the economy, the language, and so on, T.M Murchison was not part of that. He was never asked, as far as I'm aware, to join them. He probably gave a lot of information to people. They were always wearing, as we say in Gaelic, a track to his house. They were never-endingly going to consult Tom Murchison. But he himself never wanted to have any, I suppose, acknowledgement of that. That was the kind of man he was. But at the same time, there was this question of the open door. Highlanders weren't charging at any open door, believe me. They were charging at a door which was only partly open at best. And Gaelic-speaking Highlanders who were involved in political development or trying to do some economic development on behalf of the Highlands, they weren't terribly popular people. It's a simple fact. Murchison was very, very concerned about this. When the Highlands and Islands Development Board was set up, he pointed out himself that there was a distinct lack of native Gaels on the board when it was created. And he asked rather pointedly how such men as Sir Robert Grieve could have access to real information about the real Highlands if the board contained no Highland insiders. So there were various tensions at that level. There were all the colonial attitudes to the Gaels and the Gaelic and so on. And Murchison was there in the middle of all these tensions. But let me say to you, my friends, that Murchison was not charging at an open door. Highland development at that time, when the crofts were being created, when farms were being divided, when land resettlement had to be done, it was a very hard job. And the government wasn't there to hand over land. The people had to fight for it. And Murchison saw all of that. A most telling story in this regard, and here I finish, comes from Andrew Murchison, son of T.M Murchison. I know Andrew quite well. When I was discussing his father's achievements with Andrew one day, Andrew told me that he would never forget the occasion, the morning a policeman in uniform appeared at the family home in Glasgow. Tom was, of course, Minister of St Columba, Copeland Road, and we knew him very much in that capacity, and the family were brought up there. The policeman came to the door. Andrew was then a small boy, and the arrival of the bobby frightened him. However, the bobby did not come with bad news or to arrest anybody. In fact, he had come with good news. And what was the good news? It was that the file held by the special branch on the Highland-related activities of the Reverend Thomas Moffat Murchison had now been closed. Now, isn't that interesting? That a minister working on behalf of Highland people, on behalf of the economic development of the Highlands, had a file in the special, kept by the special branch. It was not an easy job, and he certainly wasn't charging at an open door. I'm not sure how the Reverend Thomas Moffat Murchison would have reacted to that. I knew him well, and he was one of the most gracious and courteous men ever to have engaged in Highland development. He must have had a wry smile at the very least, knowing that one particular door at least was now closed. He himself made the point more than once that the only door that was potentially open to him, particularly in the fraught days of Highland hydroelectric power schemes, when he was summoned to appear before the Committee of Privileges of the House of Commons, the only door that was potentially open to him was that of the Tower of London. So if historians claim that T.M Murchison and Lachie Grant were charging at an open door, well, yes, there was indeed an open door, but it wasn't the one that would have given Tom Murchison or Highland crofters more freedom. Thank you very much.